In today's video, I'm going to be focusing on another decision-making question you have to ask yourself when playing poker, which is, where should my value come from? Now, in the last video that I made, we talked about the concept of equities, mainly how range construction leads to equities, which leads to certain incentives. If we continue on the topic of equity, there are situations where you have a huge equity advantage, and usually when this happens, by betting, your opponent is forced to overfold. So in a situation like that, if we ask ourselves, where should our value come from? Well, it's usually just making a bet because we have a very high equity advantage, which forces our opponent to overfold. So betting, due to the equities and the overfolding that's going on, is often going to be higher EV than checking. Compared to if we're in a situation where the equities are closer together, fold equity is going to be less because your opponent is not forced to overfold. Now, next to equity and ranges, there are two more important components when considering where your value should come from. Number one being the strength of our hand. Number two being the tendencies of my opponent. Now, every hand in your range is interested in the pot becoming a certain size. If you look at our value hands, usually we will just play our value hands for what they are worth. Then we invent bluffs around our value to make sure that our opponent is incentivized to pay off our value. Let's dive into an example. So the example I picked here is Jack 8-5 Rainbow. We're playing big blind versus button. Check call or 1/3 c-bet. Turn is a 7, it goes check, check, and river is a deuce. Up to us, where should the value come from given the strength of our hand? And when we say strength, in this case we mean our hand has a certain amount of equity, and from there we're gonna look at which type of actions certain equity profiles like to take, okay? So let's start with the lowest type of equity hands that we can have, that are made hands, or at least that have some sort of showdown value. I'm gonna talk about the bluffs at the end. They clearly want to check because they're too weak to bet. Okay, their value shouldn't come from getting called. Their value should come from checking and trying to get the showdown. And depending on if you think your opponent is bluffing a lot, they will probably be used for bluff catchers in position bets. And indeed, we can see this region is going to be calling or raising around half of the time. Okay, these are bluff catchers, so these should be placed as bluff catchers, not as value bets. So that would be the first mistake that you can eliminate if you are betting a lot of these hands. Now, do note that the smallest sizing I gave here is 25%. Let's say we give it a min bet. Then suddenly, especially in this profile, the 50 to 60% equities, where we can actually see some betting starting. Most probably if we give it a 10% option, we can actually squeeze out these hands with it for a 10% bet. Okay, basically the lower your bet sizing, the lower in equity you can go to value bet your hand. But you don't want to add 10%, 25%, then it gets maybe a bit too complicated. So let's keep it this way. 25%, we can see that from 50% equity, so basically the higher our kicker in this case with our 7, the more we are going to be betting, simply because they're higher in equity, they get called by worse hands more often. Okay, so apparently this is our value betting threshold. These hands, they're close between, well, we could actually get some value, but if we check, we also get some bluffs. So the EVs are the same. Basically, it's gaining the same amount of value in check by inducing bluffs as it gets by betting 25% and getting called. So there's no clear action profile with this hand. It's the hand class above 60 to 70% action where we can see a very clear preference for one action being better than the other, which is just to block. And why is that? Because an 8 is trying to get value from a 7. So the 60-70% equity hands trying to get value of the 50 to 60% equity hands, which if we check, Finin is going to be checking behind most of the time. Whereas if we would bet, in this case block, it would never be folding a 7, or let's say for example a 5, hence that it would always check behind. Okay, so there's clear downsides in checking and clear benefits in betting. Now the reason I saw the ace 7 is checking, and you will see this quite often, for example PVB in delayed lines or big blind first button and check call check check. This is again because if we have the ace is a hand that would call a block bet very often, as you can see ace high, ace 9, ace queen, ace king. And if we check, ace high is going to check behind most of the time. So for the same reason, basically blocking the check backs is usually the heuristics why we suddenly check a hand like that. So that was the 60 to 70% equity. 70 to 80, here we see it again a bit with the ace 8, but ace 8 is stronger than ace 7, so it's not a pure check. It actually prefers blocking for the same reasons that I just explained. And 70% equity. 78% equity, apparently that's where it starts to flip a bit, and it's actually start to worth 3/4. Let me add those here. It's just on the threshold, it's 78. So basically, let's say it's in the 80% region. 80% region also has a clear preference. It no longer wants to block. Okay, it's worth more. So again, it's an example. We're just betting the strength of our hand. It's worth 3/4. So what do we bet? 3/4. In general, you have your value size because there's value hands that are incentive to bet that sizing. That's why a 75% rolled out, because we have a lot of these 80% type of equity hands that want to bet 75%. Okay. Clear action profile. A jack rarely to never wants to check because it just loses so much value from all the 7x, some 8x, some 5x that are going to check behind that would call a bet. Only if your opponent is extremely over bluffing, but I'm getting ahead of myself, then maybe we could consider checking it, or like I said, based on certain kickers. But in general, when we get to higher types of equity, the 70-80 has a very clear profile, which is block, and the 80 to 90 has a very clear profile, which is to bet medium. Now, if we go up, this is actually where it gets complicated, because now you would say, well, if it was check, block, 3/4, now we're just gonna overbet, right? But now suddenly we see a bit of everything. King Jack, 91% equity, has a very clear action profile. Where should the value come from with King Jack? Betting an overbet and getting max value out of 9s, 10s, 8x, worse Jack X. That's apparently what King Jack is worth. Now, again, the ace is checking for the reason that I explained, and maybe ace Jack can also check raise. And this is where basically the confusion comes in with all these hands that suddenly do a bit of everything. Once we reach a certain amount of equity, which I think is like 95% in this case, we can suddenly play our hand in all types of ways. Now, why is that? If you have a very strong hand, obviously you could overbet. You make a lot of money that way. But when you check and your opponent bets, our hand is that strong that we can now check raise. Okay? So we actually gain a lot of value as well by checking. If we block and villain raises, and we have the nuts, we can bet 3-bet all in. So there's various ways, if we have a 95% plus equity hand, to get our money in. So there's less of a clear action profile compared to with a jack. A jack will not check raise if it checks, so there's no added benefit. It will not block 3-bet if it blocks. So there's a very clear action profile because of the amount of equity that it has. All right. Now, again, we saw that with these very strong hands, we saw the blocker properties playing in, mainly pocket 7s. Clearly wants to check because it has less downsides. Because the main downside of checking is that a 7x checks behind. But we have 2 7s, so it's less likely that he has a 7. So there's less downsides, so therefore we check. Whereas 9-10 has less of these properties, so you can see it just mixes a bit of everything, okay? And it just makes sure that in every line, which is, it is important in practice, but especially in a solver, you have to realize that your opponent can see your strategy. It's a transparent strategy, so it has to be perfectly balanced. And therefore it just puts a little bit of nuts in all the sizings, so all sizings are protected, okay? And in certain hands, because of certain properties, have a preference for clearly a big overbet, like 5 deuce. Clearly just wants to overbet, and that's because if we have 5 deuce, maybe check raise is a bit on the thin side, or block 3-bet is maybe a bit on the thin side. And if we have a 5 and a deuce, he has more 7x, 8x, 9x, which 9x, 10x, Jack X, which could call an overbet. So very clear action profile for the 5 deuce. And the bet 3-bet all in is clearly reserved for the nuts, right? 99.9% equity. Because the other hands are also not 99.9% equity, therefore bet 3-bet all in could maybe be a bit too expensive. So I hope this makes sense. I think it's very clear that based on the strength of our hands, we want to do certain things, okay? Now, to finish it up, I wanted to quickly talk about the bluffs. The bluffs, also again, you will see not a very clear action profile, but the purpose of these bluffs is they're just also being distributed amongst the sizings so that no sizing is unbalanced. So every sizing has some nuts, every sizing has some bluffs. Therefore, in position is not incentivized to do something drastically different, okay? If one line would never have bluffs, obviously your opponent is no longer incentivized to pay off and your value would suffer, okay? So that's the reason why basically bluffs just go all over the place. Certain bluffs might have specific specific profiles why it wants to bet overbet. For example, king queen clearly wants to overbet if it does something. That's probably because king jack and queen jack are definitely in the check back line on the turn quite often, and they will always call an overbet. So mainly I guess blocker properties play with the king queen. All right. Now the second thing to take in consideration in where your value has to come from is who is my opponent, and then mainly looking at their tendencies in terms of aggression and willingness to fold. To give you an example, the more aggressive your opponent, the more your value should usually come from checking towards him and letting him bluff. Whereas if your opponent bluffs less and it is more on the passive side, usually your value should be gained by getting called instead of getting bluffed, because it's not the type of opponent that will do a lot of bluffing if we check towards him. Let's continue on the same example as before and look at different profiles and how our strategy will change. Now, in order to answer this question, I switched to Pio because it's customizable with node lock function, which we're going to be needing in this example. Actually, in GTO Wizard is going to be coming up very soon as well, but we basically see the same things in the Pio example as in the GTO Wizard example, even though it might not be exactly the same ranges. Sevens is still the hand that checks, same with A7, an 8 still wants to block, King Jack still wants to overbet, 9-10 still wants to do a bit of everything. So basically, it's the same thing. So now we're wondering, well, what if we face a more aggressive opponent? What will change? If we look at if we check, our opponent is betting 38% of the time. And if it has air, we go to Range Explorer and we say air, which I guess is nothing in this case. I guess King High could also be nothing. So if it has air, it's in a balanced strategy allowed to bet that air 56% of the time. This is his bluff allowance, as we say. So what if our opponent has nothing and just always bluffs? How would that impact our strategy? So if we look at our current strategy, we're checking 42% of the time, okay, and betting small 22% of the time. Now let's go to the node lock function and say that our opponent has nothing. And you know, your opponent's like, well, can't win if you check, so let's just never check. Let's just always bluff. Now, he is confusing. Yes, you will statistically win the pot more often if you bet than if you won't. But he's confusing trying to win the pot with making the highest EV decision. Now, obviously, if your opponent is overfolding, by all means, always bluff. But in the equilibrium, it is, in this case, not the case. We're not allowed to bluff everything as in position. We were actually allowed to bluff everything as out of position. That's everything to do with the fact that we check folded all of our air, and in position as c-betted all his air on the flop. So basically just by check calling out of position and the turn 7 being very improving for our range, we get to bet all the air that we arrive to the river with. So we lock the strategy. Save close. It's going to take only a second. So where should our value come from? We had strength of our hand, and now based on the tendencies of our opponent, in this case, villain is more aggressive. Now what do we see? Instead of, I don't recall exactly, but I think we're checking around 20% more, and mainly the small bet starts to disappear. And this is a very important point. This is also why I highlighted how often are we betting small. Because you can see now the 7x that I think was the threshold for value betting. If you recall, it was like sometimes betting, sometimes checking, because both EVs were very close. Well, now if we check towards in position, he's over bluffing, so the EV is no longer close. Checking to induce bluffs because villain is aggressive or over bluffing is now clearly making more money than if we would be betting ourselves. Okay. Same with the 8x. It's mainly going to be like these lower EV hands that clearly now just want to be checking and inducing bluffs. As you can see, if we have Jack 10, which is worth 3/4, basically everything that was worth 3/4 to begin with is not checking to induce bluffs, okay? That's not where its value should come from based on the strength of its hand. Now there is a point, okay, where your opponent is going to be so over bluffing and so, or in general, so betting so often that we can basically just check everything. But you have to realize that then if you're wrong and if your opponent's not over bluffing, it costs you more money with Jack 10 than it would cost you with 10-8. Makes sense? Now another adjustment that we're going to make is then when your opponent bets, as you can see, we're never folding, because if our hand wasn't good enough to be calling a bet, we would have betted ourselves, because our bluff allowance was 100%. We were always bluffing. The only hand that checks and sometimes wins at showdown that doesn't always want to bluff was the king queen. Remember, that was the hand that wanted to overbet, because all the 5x now gained value and the 7x also gained value. Now the 5x we were already checking, so basically nothing really changed, the fact that we're always calling. But it's mainly the 7x and 8x that now has gained EV because of the tendencies of our opponent. Now this is a river example, but this concept will apply on every street. The reason why we're, for example, as initial raiser on the flop or turn, why we're c-betting, okay, is because we want to get money in the pot. Well, if your opponent's very aggressive in probing, then checking towards him, letting him bet, and moving a lot of your bets to the check raise, that's a way that we can get money in the pot. All right. So if your opponent does all the aggression for you, there's usually less downside in checking, and therefore, you know, we can gain. Where should our value come from? Well, checking and letting the guy build a pot so we can build an even bigger pot after that. Now on the flip side, we also have more passive opponents. For that, actually, I also included the min bet. And we actually can see what I mentioned earlier. 10-7 was a check, king 7 was a check. Now they became a min bet, and basically we're just moving down. Even pocket sixes now can sometimes throw out a min bet. Usually just the smaller you bet, the more you can bet for value. Basically the lower you can go down the equities. So what happens if our opponent, instead of being too aggressive, is going to be too passive? Well, if we go again, so instead of nothing 41% of the time, he's like, he's never folding, I'm never bluffing, I'm just always going to check. Now the main difference you're going to see in these kind of scenarios is that the smallest sizings will start to disappear, okay? And that's because small sizings in general are already close to check, and the EV of check has just gone up. Now why has the EV of check gone up? Well, basically if we check and our opponent is not bluffing all the time, especially with his king highs, ace highs, whatever, 3/4, we basically always get to fold. All right, there's no more incentive. Also, if we look at our strong hand, pocket sevens, which was pure check, simply because if we check, he's not going to bet often enough. Now in the river example, especially with this hand, like a 7x, a weak 8x, they become very clear checks, mainly the 7 and some 8x. These are the hands that gain EV when people are under bluffer. Now, mainly on earlier streets, let's say flop and turn, I think this is very important, because inducing versus someone who's not bluffing, that's usually not really a great idea, right? If you're trying to play based on where should my value come from, and if you have some reach on your opponent and he's more of the passive type, and starting to induce certain hands, it's not really going to add you a lot of value. They're usually passive, so just check your weaker hands to him. He's going to bet, which is fine. You can just fold your weaker hands because he's not going to bluff. This is how you exploit more passive opponents at your tables. So your value in this case should come from checking more weaker hands towards your opponent, and when he bets, you simply are going to fold. It's as simple as that. So with the explanations out of the way now, we're going to be jumping into a live play and explain session where I'm really going to be focusing in on where should my value come from. Let's go. Okay, got 2 tables of 200NL. If you haven't seen my previous video that I made about what's his range, definitely go check that out. It will be kind of the same concept, only this time we will be focused on where should my value come from. Now, there might be some situations where obviously I will highlight again, like, what is his range, because obviously his range will also determine where our value has to come from. I don't know this pool very well, so I don't think I'm gonna make huge adjustment based on player types, but if there's a certain situation where I feel like, versus a specific player profile, I would definitely choose a specific action with a hand. I will definitely highlight that. Before we start, quickly, Mechanics of Poker 2.0. We're currently open to receive new applications, new students for our program. If you want to work together with me and Adam, make more progress in your poker career, one of the most complete poker coaching programs on the market. This week, I think up until the 7th of September, you can apply. After that, we will close again. So if you want to get the chance to work with me and Adam, apply now. Without further ado, let's get into the pool and put an extra focus on where should my value come from. And this can be mainly depending on a couple of tendencies. We already talked about the range that we're facing. We talked a lot about, in the intro to this video, about the strength of our hand. And also we talked about the tendencies of our opponent. These are usually kind of the three main areas to consider. And I've tagged a lot, but these tags are probably going to be on the older side. Don't know how reliable they're going to be. With nines, I think an easy call here to a 3-bet on the button. Queen high board. I believe on a queen high board we get to pew this. It's an ace high board, or ooh, he goes half pot. Versus half pot, I think it's close without a club, to be honest. 6, 7, very close. We can turn straight draws on a 6, a 7, a 10, and a jack. That's why I still called, but not 100% sure. Here, jack high board's probably gonna be somewhere between 1/3 and half pot. I'll go 40%. That's usually, if I'm in doubt, like what it's going to be, I'll choose that. It goes check on the turn. Bit weird. Where should my value come from? I don't think value betting here is going to be appropriate. He will definitely pot control the turn. There's not a lot of 8x. I think they will half pot. So we should probably start with check and then decide if we should bluff catch. Here, suits are going to be very important in these type of scenarios. We're playing a 3-pot in quite tight formations. So having like removal and blockers and stuff have a very big impact on the fold equity. So the queen is okay, but the king of diamonds is quite bad because he could have floated king queen of diamonds, for example. And I don't block any suited king x. Definitely bet check betting here on the river, of course. I chose to go for a half pot sizing simply because we are probably more on the capped side. So he does indeed go for the check raise. We don't, I mean, we block one queen jack, which I guess is good. His main bluffs are gonna just have to be pocket pairs, but 5, 6s check raise. So it's gonna be like something like pocket 8s that he has to turn into a bluff. I'll call it. The problem is on the river, if I had good suits that would block the jack-axe, I would have most likely barreled. So on the river, we're probably actually left with just a lot of bad hands to call the river check raise. Here with the 8-4, actually in hindsight, I check quite fast. I wouldn't have minded a lead. But I think it's a bit more appropriate on an 8 or 9. Where should value come from with the 8? Definitely not value betting. It's in the lower bracket in terms of equity, so it's going to be a check and then deciding versus bet check bet if we should call or not. Which I would say Queen 4, King 4. King 10. I'm actually going to fold, but I'm going to go for 4-bet here with the King Jack. I'm actually curious what the guy had with 9s earlier. He had Ace 4 spades. With a small bet. The King Jack. Probably a spot where we're gonna do a lot of double and maybe triple barreling. This, for example, is a turn. We just get to apply so much pressure because he will have some proportion of hands like 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s, which we don't have. So basically, I would say we can c-bet range on both streets. So where should our value come from? Basically, we're utilizing our equity advantage by putting a lot of pressure. And because we have this equity advantage, we force him to do a lot of folding on all streets. Now on the river, where should our value come from? Getting called or getting bluffed? Kind of depends. You can also go middle. When I'm in doubt between where should the value come from, getting called or getting bluffed, sometimes I go in the middle, like this. Here, I think I'm going to overbet. I think it's pretty capped. Oh, yeah. Well. Alright, well. Jam indeed felt a bit close. So then it's a question of, do we check and induce a bluff of like a flush draw? A missed flush draw? But then we probably miss value out of the ace jack and ace queen of heart type of holdings. Or maybe like a hand like pocket queens. Reverse block. I'll try this. He's just gonna have a worse king quite often. Or do we check and let him, let's say he did pew 9s twice or 8s, let him turn that into a bluff on the river. But like I said, then we lose value against the a6 of hearts. But is a6 going to call? Given the way the board runs out, it's very hard for us to show up with a lot of bluffs. Most probably have to turn like queens or jacks or something into a bluff. So yeah, it's an interesting spot. Here versus recreational, I believe. Just gonna barrel the scary king. Hope he falls. That is the very advanced strategy here. And hope something scary comes on the river. It doesn't. I think I'm just gonna give up. Set. Good give up. Yeah, very interesting spot. King, queen. Now this is also a very interesting spot in terms of where should our value come from. Here I would definitely play different based on the opponent that I'm playing. So different tendencies of your opponent will definitely change strategies here. I'm gonna go for the default GTO. Go from there. Because I don't know who this guy is. I would say GTO is just gonna check a lot. And from the big blind. And definitely this is going to be a check call. Good turn, obviously, if he had queen jack. Now in. Check, check. I think on the river we have to check again. 5 suited. Can call a 3-bet. I don't mind a check raise, to be honest, with my exact hand. Here on the flop, I'm going to play big bet check. I think 5-4 of hearts is fine to go in the big bet. This guy is thinking about it. I have a feeling he has... He was thinking about sizing, so that's what he was thinking. Very weird. Definitely gonna go for bet here. Don't mind that. King, queen. The pot bet kind of throws me off a little bit, I have to say. I'm gonna fold simply because he bet a pot. If he would have betted just like quote normal 3/4, I guess I would have called, because pot is, if you just look at average population, pot is gonna be an infrequent sizing. So people then put in a bit more thought. And now we're on the river. I'm going to jam the 5-4. Hope he doesn't have a better hand. Here at the 9s, actually, I'm going to go for a check. Again, a board that is very similar as the other board, which are very... You can definitely play different depending on the tendencies of your opponent. The only thing that I would... the king-queen hand is really weird, because the line makes very little sense, especially given the fact that I have the king of diamonds. Like I said, the pot bet kind of threw me off. So that it's a more infrequent use sizing. If you just look at globally population, let's say, for example, 3/4 is probably going to be 6 times more likely or something. 6 times more used than a pot bet. Then usually, my general experience would say that pot then is stronger. Now, obviously, you know, if you play more versus people, it's always interesting if an uncommon sizing is used somewhere between 80 to 105. It's always a good idea to try to pay attention to what this sizing is meaning. 9-10 is 11.5 is quite big. I'll fold. Let me know what you guys think. The line makes no sense in my opinion, but the sizing kind of threw me off. The 5-4, I think, kind of played itself. On turn, we could also check, but yeah, by check if you can also overbet. And then the river, I think the river we have to just jam it in. But I think I played that hand well. The turn, I think you like these type of hands, like a bottom pair type ish hand, should definitely be in your strategy. If you look at range constructions, you want to have some sort of low pairs usually in the range. So if you would only bet a king X and draws, for example, a hand like ace queen on the king 10-5 or ace jack, in general ace have flush draws and stuff, they increase a lot in their EV in calling, and a middle pair like a 10 has an easier fold. This is probably actually a fold on zoom, but that's off is probably also close, but hey, we're in position this time, not folding here. So yeah, by basically adding like some of these lower pairs in your barreling range, it becomes a bit less clear for the defender which hand is better, ace queen or a 10. We face a check here on this board. I'm gonna go for a small bet here with the 6-5. Now you could say, okay, we can also then use this hand, but I think this hand is a bit too strong to bet. So if you want to apply the same concept, You would probably pick a hand like pocket deuces with a heart or something to overbet on the turn. You can put way more pressure on a 6. Get called by like the ace king and the ace queen with a heart. And a lot of it is as well like bluff prevention in both scenarios. Let's say you had deuces here on the turn, or the 5x. Let's say it goes check, check, and he bets the river. Something's gonna get bluffed. And I'm definitely not biting the river. Okay, so he had ace 8 with a heart. So he could then also ask himself the same question. Where should my value come from? With the 8 of hearts and an ace. That to get called or bluff catched. Here in the king 10-4 two-tone. You can play small bet as well, but I like to play big bet sports. It's quite close, king 10-4. If it was king queen 4, I would definitely play big bet check. If it was king 10-6, I would definitely play big bet check. So now it's up for you guys to figure out what's the heuristic. So those are the boards where I would have a clear preference, but on that board I don't really have. You can go either way. Here with the ace jack, I'm checking it down. In hindsight, I think actually a turn over bet is quite good. You can put quite a lot of pressure on like lower pairs, and he's going to call you with the other ace highs. Obviously checking it's not awful. I think checking ace king and then betting ace jack on the turn for an overbet I think is good. So where should his value come from? With the ace 8, he had the ace of hearts. But he could obviously value bet versus my 6x that I had, or like a 9x that I bet check, or a 10x that I rivered. And your hand is not that strong that you're gonna go for a check raise. So like the ace of hearts, if he had that, then by all means check, because you can check raise, so it gains a lot of EV that way. I would say the jack of hearts. Also, I would probably now check back. It kind of depends if I would check back deuces with a heart, for example. Probably not actually, but also I could have rivered a straight with 7-8. So actually, I think his check is not great with the ace of hearts, 8 of hearts particularly. I think he should just bet. So then you could ask, well, is this maybe then an exploitative check to let me stab something random? No, I could see that he's just doing that from an exploitative perspective. We're gonna check back some hands, and your other card is going to be very important. I think the ace of hearts, definitely the ace of hearts, or an ace in general, but especially the ace of hearts and the ace of spades are gonna make for checks on the turn. I would never check queen jack, I think. Or at least I would be less likely to check back queen jack. Because then he has more aces, he has more ace high flush draws, stuff like that. Also interesting from his side now, where should his value come from? Should he bet? He bets 10%. I like that. So when you're in doubt between what you're gonna do, I really like 10%. I'm actually going to just call this with the ace of hearts, because there's less. So he doesn't have the ace high flush that I can now get value from, or aces. So if I would have checked back queen jack or queen 10, I would definitely just raise, but I think this hand is just a call.
Hi guys, Rene aka The Wacko here with a quick Mechanics of Poker 2.0 announcement, because we are currently open to receive 10 new players in our Mechanics of Poker coaching program. In our program, you will get access to 80 plus hours of content in which we will explain you all aspects needed in order to become a more successful poker player. Now, one of these, of course, is the technical aspect of the game, in which I'll be explaining you all the mechanics behind poker strategies. We'll be talking about GTO, exploitative play, with an extra focus on the why behind certain strategies and why the population has certain leaks. And to increase your win rate even further, we've recently added a river bluff and bluff catching section so you can increase your EV when those pots become very big. Our mindset and performance coach Adam Carmichael, he took care of the mental game and performance section of this program, in which he will teach you everything you need to know in order to break through limiting beliefs, better handle your emotions, break free from tilt, and play your A game more consistently. And last but not least, we've added the management and optimization section in the program, in which we will give you various tips and tricks to make it more likely for your poker career to succeed, and how to continuously improve as a poker player. Now, on top of that, this concept is continuously evolving based on feedback and suggestions we get from our community. Next to all this content, you will have access to our exclusive Discord community, monthly live Q&A calls, and one-on-one coaching session in which we are going to be reviewing if you have been implementing the stuff that we teach you in the mechanics of poker correctly. So do you think you have what it takes to master the mechanics of poker? And will you take one of the 10 available seats? Go over to mechanicsofpoker.com and apply for the program, and maybe you will get a chance to work with me and Adam and make more progress in your poker career.
Too bad the pool is a bit short, so we don't have a lot of EP-MP situations. Let's say we were under the gun versus a big blind. Sometimes I won't have Jack-8 suited, but it's actually an okay hand to use as a bluff in tighter formations. Whereas in cutoff, I think we have a check and usually a fold to aggression, in my experience. 9-10, I think we have a pretty easy check back on the flop. To kind of protect our check back range, so it's not only high cards. Then and like 9-10, 9 jack I really like personally. Check again on the turn. Step on the flop here with 3-7. I thought we had it feels like I already have a straight, to be honest. I was looking at the flop and I was like, I have a straight. I don't have a kicker here. Should I still raise? You see, then we probably want to raise something. So if kicker doesn't play, then let's say I had, no, I don't have that. I definitely can have a check back ace. I'm just gonna call. You guys already check raised. Let's throw it through. I don't mind throwing out a flop. Huh. Had it. He had it, and we rivered him. Nice. So I was looking if that would apply, but I think I'm gonna be checking back flop turn with enough still ace highs that I don't have to raise him. And like I said, my 9 doesn't block. Let's say I had 9-4 suited or 9-5 suited. I think raising is fine. This is close, but probably calling at least one with pocket eights. This is also close. but I decided to call here with the ace-9. Checks, I think we have no business betting. This one is quite interesting. I don't mind a block 3-bet. It's actually pretty good play. And here we just check it down. Hope he doesn't have a 9 with value bet actually. Oh, luckily we didn't value bet. Got a fold there with the ace. No, I think that so. Well played. On this river, so I showed an example in the theory where we would have 3 different sizes, and that was because I chose a run out that we had the equity advantage, and usually when you have the equity advantage, you're not really restricted in terms of sizings that you can use. Here, however, the king was very good for him on the river, and it's a flush complete. If he constructs his range well, he will definitely check back some flush draws on the turn. Now, obviously, if we then back to the first video that I made in this little 2-part series, if he doesn't have any flushes that he checks back on the turn, now obviously that changes things, but I think this is a spot where I would usually start with block. I guess there's maybe some specific hands that wouldn't mind overbetting, like a set. This again, actually, I think is also an interesting hand in terms of where should my value come from. The more aggressive your opponent is, the more I would lean towards check. The more passive your opponent is, the more I would lean towards bet. I don't know this guy, so I just RNG'd it. That's kind of the solution. Here we have the queen of diamonds, which I guess would be an okay bet. I'm actually going to check twice. Fold low again. So this is... explain. Now, bet. This is pretty YOLO. Let me see. Did we win with the ace queen? Ace 9 versus MP, probably a fold. So any hand that is a roll or RNG means that they are close. Then if we have no information about our opponent or about our population, then by all means, you know, roll away. Because that's kind of the whole idea, right? There's no one line that's better than the other. But as soon as we gain information, all these hands that are close, they are no longer close. There is actually a clear answer. So by all means, like I said, in this situation, if I was with ace queen versus a passive opponent, why would you check back ace queen to, first of all, induce? That makes no sense. Because you're inducing nothing, but he's passive. And second of all, why would you protect versus someone who's passive? If he would attack checkbacks, he would not be passive. So then sometimes people say, yeah, I'm not going to exploit the fact that he's passive, because if I would not check back ace queen, he would start being aggressive, but the guy's passive. And the guy wakes up and he's like, today I'm going to play poker and I'm going to play passive. It's not like, oh, but versus this guy, he doesn't check back ace queen. What was it? A7-4. So versus him specifically, I'm going to be aggressive, but normally I'm passive. No, it doesn't work like that. So we don't have to, you can take a more exploitative approach and don't have to be so paranoid about the possible readjustments that they can make. And in the end, your game will be reasonably balanced. Okay? If you're concerned about that, because sometimes you play versus an aggressive opponent and you always check back ace queen, for example. And if you play versus a passive opponent, you will just never check back ace queen. But that's kind of how it works. This spot can kind of go at sixes. The higher my pairs, I think. Ooh, this one's pretty close. Check. And in the end, then your stats will balance, and even your own stats. Let's say, and this is actually most probably true, let's say you play versus a majority passive opponents. This actually works in your favor. So You check back weaker ranges to fold turn because you're playing into the fact that he's passive. So basically it doesn't matter that you check back weak and fold turn because he doesn't construct enough bluffs in his range anyway. That makes sense. But I wanted to come full circle. You play versus a pool that's overly passive. This is actually great because every time you're just checking, you're folding turns. And then suddenly, okay, then suddenly you play versus aggressive opponent. He sees you maybe also as foldy on the turn, but versus him, you check back a completely different range. So it actually would play in your advantage. So some examples of where should my value come from, given tendencies of my opponent. Check raise. Check raise is pretty sexy. Can he have 9-10? No, we can definitely. Yeah, I feel like the 8 will probably have enough showdown value to at least start with check. And then I think if he bets, I'm gonna jam. Because he will never have 9-10 and we can easily have 9-10. Here, the suits are quite nice to bet. I'm a little bit YOLO here. I think this guy just sat down. I've played 0 hands with him. Normally I would indicate this as a sign of strength, but if it's the first hand someone played, it can also just be a spazzy guy. I'm gonna go for it. But maybe he's so spazzy that he now just jams. And you should maybe reconsider. King, queen suited. I think one of the hands that I would call most of the time. The hand that clearly prefers calling. I'm gonna check this flop. Recreationals raise way more on the flop, and I don't want to bet fold this hand. King, queen. We probably lead this sometimes. Let's do that now. Gonna go for the check again for the same reasons explained earlier. Probably going to check call. Maybe lead an ace or something. Play. He raises. I think we have. Oof, actually, I think we might have a call. To be honest, with king queen. This is, okay, guys. This is gonna be very funky. Okay. Call. Where should our value come from? Probably now leading out ourselves. I would say. Good thing with fish is they can still do something funky, but when he bet 3 big blinds on a turn, I think he can have a 6 or a 9. So I think checking on the river is a mistake. You should just always block. Because especially versus recreationals, but in general, block is kind of... It's close between both options. Block is probably the line that gets both that thin value out of a 6 or 7s, 8s, 9 that he's going to check behind. And he will still pass raise. So... I would happily call off a jam there versus recreational. I think it's an important lead. If you check there on the river, you're not thinking about where your value should come from given the strength of your hand. Recreational. Usually I just bet smaller versus recreational, but I can see big betting as well. And I wanted to come back to my king-queen because people are now like, Wacko, can I explain this fucking king-queen here? I'm actually going to barrel turn. I think, obviously I would prefer to have a club. But I think also without a club, it's just good unblockers to the folding range. He will sometimes call with worse, king-10 with a club, for example. On bluff prevention, he will have way more 5x and random jack-8 offsuit than... Actually going to check. Where should value come from? Quite close this one, but I feel like recreationals If you check, then often something can happen. Like, for example, what happened now. King Jack. Close, he did make it 10. Did we induce something random? No, just his king. But I feel like checking back versus recreational there is a bit better than betting, simply because they can just start blasting away. So where should your value come from? Getting called or getting bluffed? I would say versus recreational is more often getting bluffed. King Jack. Late call. On at least flop. And probably turn as well. I think King Jack is probably better than Ace 5. So I would probably call King Jack. He checks, which he do quite a lot. Check as well. His bluff should now probably come from 6s, 7s, 8s, but he should probably also start bluffing that on the turn quite often. Simply just unblockers. Bets. Fuck the king 9 suited. That's good. Definitely going to call this some of the time. Yeah, I think I'll call this. Nice hand, nice hand, nice hand. So I thought the 3/4 sizing is a bit more polarizing. Since both players are going to check quite strong on turn, I don't think Ace 5 suited or something, for example, is worth 3/4. And it's easy to have 5-4 suited, 5-6 suited, pocket 6s, pocket 7, pocket 8s. Try to bluff me off King Jack, so I would say it's fine. 10 Jack. Guy's been getting away. Let's see what he got. Uh-oh. We could be getting in dicey territory. Come on, just punish me, rip it in. Fold. 10s, jacks, what we do. We block 10s and jacks with a diamond. Probably we're getting ourselves in messy territory. Fold. Yeah, probably doesn't give up. We want him to probably have 10s and jacks. Or is he actually going to call 10s and jacks? I guess 10s and jacks should actually probably gonna give up. There's no offsuit combos of ace queen, ace jack or something in his range that he's always going to fold the river. I guess he could fold 8s. Okay, add it. Oh, good thing that we gave up then, huh? Let's try it again with ace king. Maybe playing 4-bet pots with ace king is better. This is actually also an interesting hand in terms of where should my value come from. Flavor is a very passive opponent. I don't think we can check fold our hand. It's too strong. So I would say versus a passive opponent, I would just block. And normally, but my normal would be check with range-ish. And again, since we don't really know him, I'm gonna check. Okay, where should my value come from? Probably 10%ing against an ace. Go for it. Does he ever have the nuts? Huh. Probably not. If he raises. He doesn't really have offsuit. I guess he can have ace king. but that's only a couple of here. How much is that? 5 big blinds. That's a lunch. That's lunch. Thank you. That's lunch. Ace 10. So, unlucky, buddy. All right. Well, playing. What did we learn in this video? You should play 4-bet pots with ace king suited instead of 10. Here, check call. Where should our value come from? Probably not bluffing. We're too high up. So start with a check and then decide if we should bluff catch. The 10 is pretty good, I think, to bluff catch. I think a lot of the 10x that he has. Gonna barrel turn. 9-10, queen 10, 9. There's more. So you should probably have something like queen x suited, king x suited. I don't mind this as a bluff catch. Close. Close. We're also running out of time back. I would have liked to have a bit more time there. Ace queen. Ace queen. Can probably check raise sometimes or check call. Go for a check raise. Because we're in an aggressive mood. Getting ourselves in some dice situations. Phew. No, yeah. Rethinking about it, ace 10 is probably horrible. You have pocket 3s, pocket 4s. They do the best job in unblocking everything. So, yeah, just a fold. I would say is the correct play. Because also on a club, like you see, let's say the turn was a spade, so not the flush complete, then I would have liked my call. But I think on the flush complete, he's going to check back more. I mean, the hand that he had, jack queen. And then I think the check back range can become a little bit too unbalanced, and then I think we can definitely call the river. 4, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, stabbing. 9-5. Like the bet, over bet. Forced to fold 9-5, I think. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, 9, 10 is would definitely fuck me over. Check, call. Check. King is not great, is it? I'm gonna barrel this some of the time. I'm not really sure. On a 98, I will barrel it. Would have preferred an 8 or a 9. What are you thinking about, buddy? Fuck my life. Fuck my life. Now we probably have to get it in. You could have 8s, 9s. Probably going to fold. You have no clubs. We block kings. I'm gonna wrap it up. I think there were definitely some spots where we talked enough about where our value should come from, based on the strength of our hand, based on some opponent's tendencies, based on certain equity advantages, disadvantages. We did actually mention some of that. If you want to make more progress in your poker career, Mechanics of Poker 2.0 coaching program now open for application up until end of this week. 7th of September, I think we close again. And then probably we will reopen maybe January, beginning of next year. So if you want to spend the time indoors this winter working on your game, let me and Adam help you. Go over to mechanicsofpoker.com or the link down below to apply to the program. And hopefully we'll see you guys there. You apply, and based on think you're a good fit, we will get in touch with you and see if we can, if it's mutually beneficial to join the program. I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, then show a like. If you disliked it, you show a dislike. That's kind of how it works. There's always going to be 1 or 2 haters. Subscribe to the channel if you didn't already. Notifications on, all that good stuff. Make sure to also follow the pod, Mechanics of Poker podcast. And I'll see you guys in the next video.